In a cold, rainy Texas morning, a former Navy SEAL named Lucas Wilson heard a sound so small it almost didn't exist, a whimper trapped inside a soaked sack. When he cut it open, 2 German Shepherd puppies stared up at him, not asking for comfort, asking for permission to live. Lucas had survived war, but he hadn't survived grief, until that silent cry found his chest again. He wasn't a praying man anymore, but he whispered, "God, please not again." And that's when the miracle started, because saving them wasn't the fight. A powerful kennel came hunting, calling them property, trying to erase every trace of what they'd done. Lucas had to choose stay quiet and let evil win politely, or step into the light and let God turn a broken man into a shield. If you believe the Lord still uses small moments to bring justice, stay with this story. Cold rain stitched the Texas sky to the red dirt, and the creek ran the color of weak coffee as wind worried the mesquite trees. Lucas Wilson lived out where the mail came late and memories came early. A 35-year-old former Navy SEAL who'd traded saltwater missions for diesel engines and quiet fence lines. He was broad-shouldered with a square jaw that looked carved by worry, close-cropped dark hair, and eyes the steady gray of storm clouds that had already decided where they were going. People in town called him Sir without knowing why, then felt a little foolish when he answered with a polite nod and nothing else. He kept his words rationed like water, not because he hated people, but because he'd learned how quickly a life could spill out when you talked too much and listened too little. A year ago, something in his last deployment had gone sideways. The details lived behind his ribs like shrapnel, and he'd come home with a discipline so tight it could choke. He fixed farm machinery for cash, slept light, and avoided the kind of attachment that made you beg the universe for refunds it never gave. That morning, he was driving his battered pickup along the service road to check a client's combine when a sound slipped through the rain and caught on his nerves. Not a bird, not a coyote, but a thin, broken whimper that didn't belong to the wild. He stopped, killed the engine, and let the silence settle. The whimper came again, from the drainage culvert that fed into Miller's Creek, where water pressed through like a crowd trying to escape. Lucas stepped out, boots sinking into mud, and followed the sound until he saw it. A feed sack wedged against rusted grating, the burlap soaked and sagging, tied with rough rope that looked hurried and mean. For a breath, his mind offered easy explanations, the way it always tried to save him from caring. Trash, rags, someone's old feed. Then the sack twitched, just once, like a small heartbeat refusing to quit. Lucas's chest tightened, the old training flipping a switch in him, and he crouched with the careful precision of someone approaching a live wire. From his pocket, he pulled a worn folding knife, its handle dulled by years and use, and he sliced the rope with one clean motion. The knot gave way, and the sack's mouth loosened like lips finally allowed to speak. Inside were 2 German Shepherd puppies, no more than 8 or 9 weeks old, all 2 big paws and trembling ribs under mud-matted fur. One, a male with a darker saddle pattern and a smart, stubborn stare, tried to bark, but only pushed out a breathy rasp, a sound that felt like a plea dressed as courage. Lucas would later think of him as the kind of soul who wanted to lead even while falling apart. The other, a female with softer tan cheeks and ears that couldn't decide whether to stand tall or fold into fear, pressed her nose to Lucas's wrist the moment he reached in, as if she could read character through skin. Her eyes were the warm brown of wet earth, and they held the desperate hope of someone who hadn't learned to stop asking. Lucas's hands, scarred and steady, shook anyway. He'd carried men heavier than engines. He'd steadied bleeding with calm. He'd followed orders that weighed tons, but 2 shivering puppies in a feed sack made his throat burn like he'd swallowed the rain. "Easy," he murmured, voice low, not because they understood English, but because his own heart did. He peeled off his canvas work jacket and wrapped both of them against his chest, tucking them under the shelter of his arms like a man trying to hide sparks from the wind. The male pup struggled once, then went still, saving his strength. The female pup gave a small, exhausted sigh and leaned into Lucas's warmth as if she'd been looking for it all her life. Lucas stood there in the mud, rain tapping his shoulders like impatient fingers, and felt a flicker of something he hadn't dared name in months. Purpose, sharp and sudden. He carried them to the truck, turned the heater to full blast, and spoke to them the way he used to speak to the sea when it got too quiet. "Stay with me. That's the job." He drove fast, but controlled, jaw locked, one hand on the wheel, the other braced lightly against the bundled pups to keep them from sliding, as though steadying them could steady him too. The town appeared through the rain like a smudged painting, and he pulled up to the small veterinary clinic off Main Street, a building with bright windows that looked like it was always waiting for someone to panic. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and wet fur. Dr. Hannah Price looked up from the front counter as the bell chimed, and the room seemed to tighten around her attention. She was in her mid-30s, average height, athletic in the practical way of someone who lifts struggling dogs without thinking twice, with auburn hair pulled into a messy bun and freckles scattered across pale skin like constellations refusing neat patterns. Her eyes were sharp green, the kind that missed nothing and forgave slowly, but her mouth softened the moment she saw the bundle in Lucas's arms. "What happened?" she asked, already moving, voice brisk with training and threaded with concern. Lucas stepped forward, rainwater dripping from his hair onto the tile, and set the pups gently onto the exam table. "Found them in a sack," he said, and the words tasted like rust. Hannah's hands were quick and sure as she unwrapped the jacket, checking gums, listening for breath, pressing warm towels into tiny bodies. Then she paused. Her face drained of color, freckles suddenly stark on her cheeks, as she lifted the male pup's ear and revealed a small, scorched-looking mark behind it, a burned symbol that didn't belong on any puppy born into kindness. Hannah's jaw tightened, and her eyes flicked to Lucas with a warning that felt older than the building. "This," she said softly, "means somebody already claimed him." And somewhere beyond the clinic walls, the rain kept falling like it knew a secret too. Rain kept drumming the clinic windows, steady as a pulse, while the heater inside fought to turn shivers into breath. Lucas sat in the corner chair like a man on watch, shoulders squared, boots still muddy, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles looked bleached. He told himself he'd seen worse than 2 half-frozen puppies, but his body didn't believe him. It responded the way it always had when something fragile depended on him, with that quiet tremor you only notice when you're trying not to. On the exam table, the male pup, Buddy, lay wrapped in warmed towels, with a tiny oxygen mask fitted over his muzzle, his chest lifting like a stubborn little bellows. Daisy, the female, was tucked against a heating pad, her ears half flopped, and her eyes tracking Lucas as if he were the only landmark in a storm. Dr. Hannah Price moved between them with the crisp rhythm of someone who had learned to keep emotion in her back pocket until the work was done. Up close, Lucas noticed the faint scar along her forearm, pale against freckled skin, the kind you get from breaking up a dogfight or reaching into a panicked kennel. Her voice was controlled, but not cold, like a blade kept sharp for mercy. "Another hour out there," she said without looking up, threading an IV line with practiced fingers, "and they wouldn't have had the strength to fight back." Lucas swallowed. His throat felt raw, like he'd been yelling, even though he hadn't. "They were tied," he said, the words coming out flat, almost accusing the air. Hannah nodded once. "I can see that." She lifted Buddy's ear again, exposing the scorched symbol behind it. Lucas leaned in, eyes narrowing, the old operator's focus locking onto detail. It wasn't just a burn. It was deliberate, too clean to be an accident, like a signature pressed into skin. Hannah's mouth tightened. "People brand livestock," she said. "Some people think dogs are the same." Lucas's gaze flicked from the mark to Buddy's face to the pup's milk teeth barely visible when he breathed, and something inside Lucas rose up hard and fast, not rage exactly, but the kind of protective force that had carried him through bad nights overseas. Hannah reached for electric clippers and began shaving the damp fur from Buddy's neck and shoulder to check for bruising. As the blades hummed, a small ridge under the skin caught her fingertips. She paused, then angled a scanner wand over the area. A soft beep sounded, ordinary as a grocery checkout, and yet it changed the room's air. Hannah's green eyes narrowed at the screen. "Microchip," she said. "And it's active." Lucas felt the weight of the word active, like a beacon, like a leash you couldn't see. Hannah typed quickly, pulling up registry data. Her jaw set as she read. "Mercer Ridge Kennels," she said, each syllable clipped. "Outside town, big operation, expensive clients." Lucas didn't know the place well, but he knew the type. Clean signs, smiling photos, charity checks waved like flags, and behind it all, rules written in money. "So they're theirs?" he asked, and hated how that sounded. Hannah's hands stilled. "The chip says someone wants them to be," she replied, then glanced at Buddy's burn mark again. "But the chip doesn't explain a sack in a culvert." Lucas leaned back, eyes traveling to Daisy. She lifted her head and gave a weak little whine, then pressed her nose into the towel as if trying to disappear. He'd met men who could endure pain without blinking, but fear like that in something small and innocent always made him want to break the world in half and rebuild it better. Hannah picked up the clinic phone and dialed with a firmness that suggested this wasn't her first time staring down someone powerful. "Eli," she said when the line clicked. "It's Hannah. I need you here. Now." 20 minutes later, the clinic bell chimed again, and Sheriff Eli Carter walked in trailing the smell of wet leather and cold air. He was a man in his late 50s, with a weathered face and a mustache gone mostly gray, built sturdy rather than tall, with eyes that looked tired in the way of someone who'd spent decades separating truth from whatever story people could afford to tell. His uniform sat on him like a habit, not a costume, and his movements were careful, as if the town's problems were all glass, and he'd learned not to knock anything over. "Hannah," he greeted. Then his eyes landed on the table and softened for half a second. "Lord," he muttered, almost to himself. Hannah explained quickly. Sack, hypothermia, the burn mark, the microchip pinging Mercer Ridge. Eli listened without interrupting, but Lucas saw his jaw tighten on the name Mercer, like it tasted bitter. "Caleb Mercer doesn't like surprises," Eli said at last, voice low. "He likes ownership. He likes control. He likes problems handled quietly." He glanced at Lucas, sizing him up the way lawmen do, not by muscles, but by what kind of storm lives behind the eyes. And he doesn't negotiate with folks he thinks he can crush. Lucas didn't bristle. He'd been underestimated before. "Then don't let him think he's right," Lucas said. Eli exhaled, a slow, wary breath. "I'm not saying give them back," he replied. "I'm saying be smart. He's got lawyers, he's got friends on boards, and he's got boys who'd rather break a man's kneecaps than file paperwork." Hannah's gaze snapped to Eli. "They were dumped to die," she said. "That's not business, that's cruelty." Eli nodded once, grim. "Which is why I need you both to understand something," he said, leaning closer. "If Mercer hears you have chipped dogs with his registry, he'll come fast, not because he loves them, because loose ends are dangerous." Hannah looked at Lucas, and for the first time her composure cracked just enough to show a flicker of fear. Lucas felt it too, but his fear didn't ask him to run. It asked him to build a perimeter. By dusk, Hannah released the pups under a temporary medical hold, making Lucas sign forms with a pen that felt too thin for what he was promising. Buddy's breathing had steadied, though he still wobbled like a tiny drunk when he tried to stand, and Daisy stayed glued to Lucas's shin as if his leg were a lighthouse. Lucas drove home with them wrapped in blankets, the cab warm and smelling faintly of wet dog and hope. His house was small, a plain rental with a sagging porch and a single rocking chair that never rocked unless the wind pushed it. Inside, it looked like a man lived there who didn't expect visitors, clean, spare, almost military in its order. Lucas laid an old sweatshirt on the floor as a nest. Daisy curled into it instantly, nose tucked under tail. Buddy tried to stand guard beside her, then toppled, offended by gravity, and Lucas found himself huffing a short laugh he hadn't heard from his own chest in a long time. He warmed water, mixed puppy formula Hannah had given him, tested it on his wrist like she'd shown, and fed them with slow patience, whispering nonsense the way you do when you don't want silence to win. Later, he tried to sleep on the couch, leaving his hand hanging down to the floor. Daisy crawled over and gently closed her mouth around two of his fingers, not biting, just holding on, as if checking whether he was real. Lucas stared at the ceiling and felt the old ghosts circling, confused by this new presence. He told himself it was temporary, just until the sheriff figured things out, just until the clinic cleared them, just. But the word just didn't stand a chance against two warm bodies breathing in his living room. At 2:07 a.m., the sound came, tires crunching gravel, slow and deliberate. Lucas's eyes opened instantly, his body moving before thought, the seal part of him snapping awake like a trap. He slid off the couch without making a sound, scooped Buddy and Daisy into the bathroom, and shut the door softly, leaving them with a towel and a bowl of water. Daisy whined once, tiny and scared. Lucas pressed two fingers to his lips in a silent promise, then moved to the dark hallway. Headlights swept across his living room wall through the blinds, white bars sliding like prison light. A truck door creaked. Boots hit gravel. Someone laughed, low and amused, as if this was entertainment. The voice that followed was male, confident, and ugly in its casual certainty. "Mercer's dogs come back to Mercer," it said. Lucas stood in the shadow with his heart steady and his hands empty, and realized with absolute clarity that this wasn't rescue anymore. It was a hunt, and he was already on the trail. The headlights outside Lucas's house lingered like a stare that wouldn't blink. He stayed in the dark hallway, breathing slow through his nose, letting instinct and training do their old, grim math. He didn't reach for a gun. He didn't keep one in the house. Not because he didn't know how to use it, but because he'd learned what weapons did to sleep and to the kind of peace you had to build with bare hands. Instead, he became a wall. He moved with quiet precision, killed every lamp, and guided Buddy and Daisy into the bathroom. Buddy, still wobbly from the cold and the clinic's meds, tried to puff up and stand between Lucas and the world, tail stiff with the idea of bravery. Daisy pressed close, her ears half raised, eyes wide and shining, as if fear had turned her pupils into little moons. Lucas crouched, voice low and clipped, the same tone he'd used when lives depended on silence. "Quiet. Stay." He set a towel down, left a bowl of water, then eased the door shut until the latch clicked like a promise. The knock didn't come. That was what made it worse. Whoever stood outside wasn't trying to be invited in. They were enjoying the control of being seen, of making their presence a weight. Lucas watched through a narrow gap in the blinds. A man's silhouette crossed the porch, tall, shoulders hunched against the cold, wearing a brimmed cap pulled low. The figure didn't look around like a burglar. He looked around like an employee, checking whether the job site was ready. Lucas called Sheriff Eli Carter with his phone held close to his chest, voice barely a breath. Eli answered on the second ring, sounding tired and instantly alert. "Stay inside," the sheriff said. "Don't engage, I'm on my way." The truck outside idled a moment longer, then rolled away, tires grinding gravel as if to underline a message. When dawn finally softened the edges of the night, Lucas found what they'd left behind. A folded note wedged under the gate latch, its paper dry despite the damp air, like someone had carried it in a pocket close to warm skin. The handwriting was blocky, confident, almost bored. "Return them by tomorrow night, or you'll lose more than 2 dogs." Lucas stared at the words until they stopped being ink and became intent. Threats weren't new to him, but this one had a different taste. It wasn't aimed at his body. It was aimed at what he was starting to care about. In the morning, he drove the pups back to Hannah's clinic for a checkup, keeping the note folded in his wallet like a splinter he couldn't pull out yet. Hannah read it, her freckles going pale. Then she exhaled hard through her teeth. "They moved fast," she said. Her hands were steady, but Lucas noticed the way she kept glancing at the front window, as if expecting that same truck to appear like a bad thought returning. "Mercer Ridge has people," she added. "People who don't file complaints. They file consequences." Lucas nodded once. "I need a paper trail," he said. The words felt strange in his mouth. In the teams, the paper trail was classified. Here, it was survival. Sheriff Carter arrived midday, coat damp, face grimmer than before. He took the note, tucked it into an evidence bag, and looked at Lucas the way a man looks at a bridge he's about to cross under heavy load. "Caleb Mercer's got a reputation for being generous," Eli said, the sarcasm faint but real. "Scholarships, donations, handshakes with cameras." He rubbed his jaw. "But I've heard things. Dogs lost in transit, paperwork too clean, complaints that vanish." "So why's he scared of 2 pups?" Lucas asked. Eli's eyes narrowed. "Because loose ends unravel sweaters." That afternoon, a woman walked into the clinic with the sort of energy that didn't ask permission to exist. Olivia Bennett was in her early 30s, average height, quick on her feet, with chestnut hair cut to her shoulders and styled like she didn't waste time being fought by wind. Her skin had the sun-kissed tone of someone who spent more hours outside than in, and her eyes were a sharp hazel that seemed to catalog everything in a room, including what people wished to hide. She wore a denim jacket, scuffed boots, and carried a small camera bag like it was an extension of her spine. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she said, which was exactly what trouble always said before it started telling the truth. "I'm Olivia. I write for the county paper, and I heard a rumor about 2 shepherd pups in a sack." Hannah stiffened, protective. Eli's expression went stern. Lucas didn't move at all, but he watched her like he'd watch a stranger entering a secure perimeter. Olivia lifted both hands, palms out. "Look," she said, voice softening. "If a kennel that charges $5,000 a puppy can't keep track of 2 babies, something's wrong. And if somebody threatened the guy who saved them, something's worse." She glanced at Lucas, reading his silence like a headline. "You don't strike me as a man who spooks easily. So why are you spooked?" Lucas didn't answer that. He didn't want to hand his inner weather to someone with a notebook, but he could feel it. This story had already started walking on its own legs, and it would go somewhere with or without him. Olivia offered what she had instead of questions. "I can dig, quietly. I've got old tips about Mercer Ridge, transport accidents, dogs that disappeared, owners who suddenly stopped calling back." Eli looked like he wanted to say no. Then he looked at the note again and said, "Be careful," which was the closest thing to permission a cautious man could give. That evening, Lucas took Buddy and Daisy home again, keeping his truck parked under the porch light, keeping his phone charged, keeping his senses sharpened until even the refrigerator's hum sounded suspicious. Daisy followed him everywhere, stepping on his heel like she feared he might evaporate. Buddy tried to act tougher, but he tired quickly, leaning into Lucas's leg when he thought no one was watching. Around midnight, Buddy's breathing changed. It started as a cough, shallow and dry. Then it deepened, hacking from somewhere too low, too wet. His little body trembled, heat rolling off him like a furnace turned wrong. Lucas pressed the back of his hand to Buddy's belly and felt the fever. His throat tightened with the old, hated feeling of time running out. Daisy whined, circling Buddy, then looked up at Lucas with frantic eyes like she was asking him to do the impossible again. Lucas didn't hesitate. He wrapped Buddy in a blanket, scooped him into his arms, and ran to the truck. The rain had stopped, but the night was sharp and cold, full of stars that looked indifferent. Daisy scrambled after him, claws clicking on the porch steps, and Lucas opened the passenger door so she could climb in. "Stay," he ordered, then softer. "Please." He drove with controlled speed, hands steady, mind counting breaths. In the clinic, Hannah met him at the door in sweatpants and a hoodie, hair down and wild, looking like a woman dragged out of sleep by a siren only she could hear. One look at Buddy, and her face tightened into focus. "Pneumonia," she said after a quick listen, voice grim. "Likely from the cold water. Possibly bacteria." Lucas watched her work, watched Buddy's chest rise and fall like it was arguing with the world. Daisy paced in tight circles near Lucas's boots, then sat, trembling, trying to be brave because he was. After an hour that felt like a lifetime compressed into fluorescent light, Buddy's breathing eased. Hannah exhaled, shoulders dropping a fraction. "He'll make it," she said quietly. Lucas's knees threatened to go soft, and he hated how close he'd come to losing something again. Hannah's gaze hardened as she cleaned up supplies. "There's another problem," she added in a lower voice. "Mercer can come at you with the law. Those chips, that mark, the registry, he can call them property. And if you refuse, he'll say you stole them." Lucas stared at Buddy, small and warm and alive, and felt a coldness settle behind his eyes that had nothing to do with weather. Outside, Olivia's text arrived like a match struck in darkness. "I found something. A file. Anonymous source. Audio." "Mercer's voice," she wrote. "It's bad." Lucas put in earbuds, pressed play, and listened to a man speak about defective stock and dumping it clean with the casual cruelty of someone discussing trash day. Lucas's face went still, the way ocean goes still before it decides to swallow a ship. He looked at Hannah, at the sleeping pups, at the sheriff's evidence bag on the counter, and understood the cost of truth. The recording could save them. Or it could paint a target so bright it would be seen from miles away. Morning came sharp and bright, the kind of Texas sun that made everything look honest, even when it wasn't. The county courthouse sat at the center of town like an old judge itself, square-shouldered in brick and faded authority, with flags out front snapping in a dry wind. By the time Lucas Wilson parked his truck, the sidewalk was already crowded with neighbors pretending they were just passing by. In a small town, curiosity didn't walk, it gathered. Lucas stepped out with Buddy and Daisy secured in a soft carrier, both pups a little stronger now, their coats cleaned up but still too thin around the ribs. Buddy's ears had begun to stand with stubborn pride. Daisy's still argued with gravity, one half pricked, one flopping like a shy wave. Lucas's face stayed calm, but inside, his thoughts marched in tight formation. This wasn't a battlefield, yet his body treated it like one, scanning exits, reading faces, feeling the pressure of eyes like heat. Hannah arrived in her clinic scrubs under a blazer that didn't quite hide how ready she was to work, rather than perform. Her hair was pulled back tighter than usual, freckles vivid in the sunlight, and her jaw looked set in the way it did when she was about to put her hands between something helpless and something cruel. Sheriff Eli Carter stood near the steps, hat low, shoulders heavy, looking like a man who had spent the night arguing with the idea of power and losing. Olivia Bennett slipped through the crowd with a reporter's quiet speed, camera bag at her hip, notebook in hand, gaze sharp as a hawk's. She gave Lucas a quick nod that said, "I'm here. And also, this is bigger than you think." Inside, the courtroom smelled of old wood, paper, and the faint metallic tang of nerves. People sat shoulder to shoulder, some leaning forward with sympathy, others with skepticism, as if love needed to show its receipts. When Caleb Mercer walked in, the room changed temperature. He was in his late 40s, tall and broad, with a polished kind of handsome that looked manufactured. Salt and pepper hair combed back, a clean-shaven jaw, and a smile practiced to land softly. His suit was dark and expensive. His cufflinks caught the light, and his eyes were a pale blue that stayed cold even while his mouth pretended warmth. He shook hands as he moved, a politician's grip, firm but not too firm, as if he never wanted anyone to accuse him of squeezing. At his side walked his attorney, Grant Holloway, a sleek man in his 30s with narrow shoulders and a sharper chin, wearing a tailored suit that fit like a threat. Holloway had the kind of voice built for microphones and objections, smooth as oil on water. Lucas didn't look away from Mercer. He'd met men who killed with bullets. Mercer looked like the type who killed with paperwork and a smile, then wrote a check to the church. The county judge presiding over the hearing was Judge Marlene Whitaker, a woman in her 60s with silver hair coiled neatly at the nape of her neck, and eyes that had seen too many stories and learned to listen for the lie hiding inside the reasonable one. She tapped her gavel once, and the room settled into tense quiet. Holloway stood first. "Your Honor," he began, voice respectful and confident, "this is a straightforward matter of unlawful possession. Mr. Mercer's kennel is the registered owner of 2 German Shepherd puppies, verified by microchip. Mr. Lucas Wilson has refused to return property that does not belong to him." The word property hung in the air like a bad smell. Lucas felt his hands clench, then force them open. Holloway continued, turning slightly toward Lucas, as if addressing a child who'd stolen candy. "We understand Mr. Wilson has a military background," he said, and the tone shifted, sugared but pointed. "And we respect his service. However, there are concerns about instability when individuals transition back to civilian life. It's not uncommon for judgment to be clouded." Hannah stiffened. Olivia's pen scratched harder. Lucas kept his face still, but a familiar heat rose behind his ribs, the old anger that came when someone tried to weaponize your scars. Judge Whitaker's eyes narrowed. "Counsel," she said coolly, "stick to facts." Mercer stepped forward, palms open, voice rich with practiced sincerity. "Your Honor, this is all a tragic misunderstanding," he said. "Those pups were lost during transport. It happens. We run a large operation. The moment we learned they were located, we acted. We want them back so they can receive proper care." He turned to the gallery, letting his smile do work. "We invest in these animals. We place them with families who can afford their training and well-being." Lucas thought of the feed sack, the rope, the culvert, proper care. He tasted the lie like grit. Hannah took the stand. She described hypothermia, dehydration, the rope abrasions, and the way the pups' muzzles showed signs of rough binding. She added, carefully and clinically, that she suspected sedatives had been used, based on sluggish reflexes and certain telltale symptoms, the kind you saw when someone wanted a living creature to stop struggling. Holloway tried to twist her words, but Judge Whitaker watched Hannah the way a hawk watches a mouse, and Hannah didn't flinch. Sheriff Carter testified next, voice firm despite the pressure he clearly carried. He described the threatening note, the late-night vehicle, the implication that someone wanted this handled off the books. Olivia didn't take the stand, but she submitted documentation. Old complaints, accounts of transport incidents, patterns of reports that seemed to dissolve once Mercer's name entered the room. Then Mercer's side called their witness. Dr. Leonard Fisk, a canine identification specialist, introduced with the kind of credentials that sounded impressive until you noticed they weren't tied to any recognizable institution. Fisk was a thin man with slick dark hair and restless hands, his suit slightly rumpled, his eyes darting too often toward Mercer, as if checking whether he was saying the right things. He testified that microchip data proved ownership beyond dispute. Holloway produced glossy papers, purchase logs, registry forms, signatures, all crisp and official. For a moment, Lucas felt the room tilt, as if money had pulled the floor at an angle. Judge Whitaker studied the documents, expression unreadable. "Mr. Wilson," she said, "do you dispute the chips?" Lucas stood. The carrier sat beside him, Daisy's small face peeking out, Buddy's head lifted as if he sensed the air had turned hostile. Lucas's voice came steady, not loud. "I dispute what they did to them," he said. Holloway smirked. "That is not the question." Lucas's jaw tightened. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his old dog tag, the metal worn smooth at the edges. When he thumbed it, it caught the light, and the engraved name on it became visible. Not his, but another. A teammate who didn't come home. The room went quiet in a way that felt accidental, like even gossip had swallowed its tongue. Buddy suddenly let out a sharp bark from the carrier, startling everyone, then lunged forward and caught Lucas's shirt collar gently with his teeth, tugging down as if insisting, "Show them." Lucas didn't yank away. He let the moment exist. He held the tag up. "I worked with military working dogs overseas," he said, and the words were careful, truthful without becoming a confession. "Dogs with markings, dogs with identifiers. That burn mark behind Buddy's ear isn't a random accident. It's a brand." Hannah's eyes flashed. She stood, asking permission to speak, and when Judge Whitaker nodded, Hannah addressed the court with quiet precision. "Microchips can be implanted at any time," she said. "They're not birthmarks, they're devices, but a burn brand, inflicted intentionally, is a sign of control. And the pup's condition is consistent with being restrained and dumped, not lost in transport." Dr. Fisk's hands fidgeted. Mercer's smile thinned by a millimeter. Judge Whitaker leaned forward, her gaze pinning Mercer like a nail. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "if these animals were merely lost, why were they found bound and near death? Why the threats? Why the urgency?" Mercer spread his hands. "Your Honor, I can't be responsible for every employee." "But you are responsible for your operation," Judge Whitaker cut in, voice sharpening. She looked down at her notes, then up at the room. "This hearing is continued," she announced. "I am ordering an investigation into Mercer Ridge Kennels and the chain of custody for these animals' identification records. Until then, temporary protective custody remains with Mr. Wilson under veterinary supervision." A ripple went through the courtroom, half relief, half shock. Mercer's eyes hardened, the mask slipping for one brief, ugly second. Outside, sunlight hit hard again as people spilled onto the steps, talking in bursts like birds. Hannah exhaled as if she'd been holding her breath for days. Olivia moved off to make calls, her face lit with the dangerous joy of a lead that could change everything. Sheriff Carter lingered close, scanning the parking lot. Lucas walked Buddy and Daisy to his truck, feeling the pup's warmth through the carrier like small beating promises. Then he saw it. A black sedan parked across the street, engine off, windows tinted. Too clean for a town that wore dust like perfume. As Lucas watched, a hand inside fogged the passenger window with breath and drew 2 little paw prints in the condensation, neat and deliberate. A second later, the hand wiped them away, erasing the message as if erasing a life. Lucas's stomach went cold. Mercer wasn't waiting for the law to finish speaking. Mercer was already planning the next sentence. The night before the warrant was supposed to hit Mercer Ridge, Lucas Wilson didn't sleep so much as he waited in shifts with his own shadow. The rain had finally moved on, leaving the air crisp and damp, and the moon hung over the fields like a watchful coin. Inside Lucas's small house, Buddy and Daisy dozed in a blanket nest near the couch, their breathing soft and steady. The kind of sound that made a man believe the world could be gentle if you guarded it hard enough. Lucas sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad, a flashlight, and his phone. He'd laid out a plan the way he used to lay out routes: exits, angles, timing, what to do if the front door shook, what to do if the back window sighed open. He wasn't looking for a fight. He was looking to survive one without becoming the thing he hated. Sheriff Eli Carter had told him the judge signed off on a preliminary search, but Lucas knew paper didn't stop people who thought they were above it. Around 1:40 a.m., Buddy's head lifted. His ears stood fully now, sharp triangles catching a sound too small for humans. Daisy woke next, pressed against Lucas's boot, trembling, but she didn't whine. She just stared at the dark like it owed her an explanation. Lucas turned off the kitchen light, leaving only the faint glow from the hallway night lamp, and he moved, quiet as a held breath. Outside, a soft scrape touched the back porch, followed by the careful click of something metal testing a lock. Lucas's pulse didn't race. It tightened, as if every beat had become a clenched fist. He guided Buddy and Daisy into the bedroom, shut the door, and whispered, "Stay." Buddy gave a low, protective grumble that sounded comically fierce coming from a pup, then sat between Daisy and the door like a little soldier. Lucas crossed to the front entrance and killed the porch light. He'd already positioned a small motion light on the side yard earlier that evening, angled to flare bright if someone cut across the fence line. He opened his phone and tapped Sheriff Carter, then Olivia Bennett. His message to Olivia was a single sentence: "If my yard lights up, roll camera and don't come alone." Olivia replied within seconds, "Already nearby." He didn't ask why she was nearby. A reporter with a conscience slept badly too. The back door handle turned again, slower this time, and Lucas made a choice that felt like swallowing a blade. He unlocked the door a fraction, not enough to open freely, but enough to make it seem loose. He stepped into the corner of the living room, where the dark collected, forcing himself to breathe shallow, quiet, patient. The latch clicked. The door eased inward. A shape slipped through, careful, practiced. The intruder was male, maybe mid-30s, lean and wiry, wearing dark work clothes and a knit cap pulled low. His face was hard to see, but Lucas caught the outline of sharp cheekbones and a nervous jaw clench, the kind of tension you see in men who do bad things for money but still want to call themselves just workers. The man held a small flashlight and a tool bag, moving like he'd been in houses like this before, searching for whatever would end the problem. Lucas didn't jump him. He let him pass the threshold. He let him feel safe. Then, Lucas stepped back so his movement would trigger the motion sensor he'd placed near the side window. The yard light outside detonated into brightness, flooding the living room through the blinds with white stripes. The intruder froze, lifting an arm to shield his eyes. At the same time, Lucas's phone buzzed with Sheriff Carter's call connecting. "Eli," Lucas murmured into the phone, keeping his voice calm. "He's inside. Back door. I'm in the living room. Lights are on." The intruder spun, panicked, and bolted toward the front. Lucas didn't chase. He pivoted, opened the front door wide, and let the man run straight into the porch light and the waiting lens. Olivia Bennett stood across the street beside her car, camera raised, her chestnut hair whipping in the wind, her eyes locked on the fleeing figure like she was photographing proof itself. Behind her, Sheriff Carter's cruiser swung in fast, tires whispering on pavement, red and blue washing the night into a confession. The intruder tried to cut left into the yard, but Lucas had already moved a trash bin and a low garden bench into a messy obstacle line, just enough to trip a man who wasn't thinking. The intruder stumbled, hit the grass, and Carter was on him in a breath, cuffing him with the weary efficiency of a man who'd been given too much darkness in one lifetime. Under the porch light, the intruder's face came into focus. Narrow nose, stubble, eyes darting like trapped mice. He looked at Lucas with something close to pleading. "I didn't want to hurt the dogs," he blurted. "I was told to get them back. And clean up anything that ties it to the kennel." Carter's mustache twitched, anger tightening his expression. "Who told you?" The man swallowed. "A guy who works for Mercer." That was enough for the warrant to stop being paperwork and become momentum. Morning arrived with heat and noise. Deputies rolled up to Mercer Ridge Kennels with the judge's order in hand, and Hannah came along as veterinary oversight, her green eyes hard, her blazer replaced with clinic gear and gloves. Olivia rode behind them, camera ready, her presence a quiet threat to anyone hoping to bury the truth. When the gates opened, the place looked pristine from the front. Manicured gravel, neat signage, banners about excellence and champion bloodlines. But behind the polished face, the truth lived in the back rows. They found cramped runs, water bowls gone slimy, paperwork that didn't match the dogs in the cages. They found microchip syringes and stacks of blank registration forms. They found a locked cabinet of sedatives that weren't logged correctly. And they found records of transport losses, filed like routine expenses. Caleb Mercer tried to greet the deputies with that same expensive smile, but it didn't land this time. Under the gaze of warrants and cameras, his polished charm looked like grease on hands. He argued, protested, demanded his attorney, and then froze when a young woman stepped forward from the staff area with trembling hands. Sophie Mercer was in her early 20s, slender and pale, with dark blonde hair tied in a low ponytail and eyes red-rimmed from nights without sleep. She wore a kennel uniform that hung slightly loose, as if guilt had made her smaller. She looked like someone who had spent too long swallowing words until they started to poison her. "It was him," Sophie said, voice shaking but steady enough to cut. "My uncle, Caleb." She flinched when his gaze snapped toward her, but she didn't step back. "He said the pups were defective stock. He said bad temperament tests would hurt the brand. He said it was cheaper to get rid of them than to explain." Her voice broke on the last phrase, and she wiped her face with the back of her hand, like she didn't feel entitled to softness. Hannah's expression tightened with heartbreak and fury. Sheriff Carter's shoulders dropped, not in relief, but in grim confirmation. Mercer's smile collapsed completely, leaving only the cold underneath. With evidence stacked like bricks and Sophie's testimony lighting the fuse, Mercer was arrested. And it wasn't just him. The investigation pulled threads into a network of falsified papers and paid silence that stretched farther than the town had wanted to admit. Weeks later, Judge Marlene Whitaker issued her final ruling. In a quiet courtroom without the earlier circus, she granted Lucas legal custody of Buddy and Daisy, citing their welfare, the abuse evidence, and the kennel's criminal conduct. Lucas didn't celebrate loudly. He just exhaled like a man finally putting down a load he'd carried too long. Outside the courthouse, Hannah stood beside him, hands in her pockets, freckles bright under the sun. "You did right," she said. Lucas looked at her, at the steadiness in her eyes, and something in his face softened. "We did," he corrected, and Hannah's mouth curved into a small, surprised smile, like she'd forgotten she still knew how. Olivia published the story with receipts, names, records, and the photo of the intruder running into the light. The town, embarrassed by how easily it had believed money, started changing in small ways that mattered. Fewer donations praised, more questions asked, more compassion offered without a camera. Sheriff Carter looked 10 years younger the first day he walked into Lucas's yard, without suspicion tightening his shoulders. And on a bright morning that smelled like cut grass and second chances, Lucas hammered a new hook into the wall beside his front door. 2 collars hung there, sturdy leather with simple tags: Buddy and Daisy. Buddy sat square and proud beneath them, chest puffed like a recruit in dress blues, while Daisy bounced on her paws as if her heart had springs. Lucas crouched, clipped the collars on, and the pups exploded into him, paws on his chest, tails beating joy into his ribs. For the first time in a long time, Lucas laughed out loud, not the short breath of surprise, but a real sound, rough-edged and honest, like a door finally opening. He looked down at 2 small faces turned up toward him like sunrise, and he understood what home was. Not a place that never breaks, but a place that still chooses you after it does. Sometimes God doesn't send a miracle with thunder and angels. Sometimes he sends it wrapped in ordinary moments. A wrong turn on a back road, a faint sound in the dark, 2 small lives that should have been lost, but weren't. Lucas thought his heart was finished, sealed tight by what he'd seen and what he'd survived. But God has a way of opening doors we didn't even know were still there, using the weakest voices to do the strongest work. Buddy and Daisy didn't just get rescued. They became the reminder that grace still shows up, that love can outmuscle fear, and that what the world tries to throw away, God can restore. If you're carrying heaviness today, remember this: your small rescue might be your own rescue too. Look around in your everyday life: a neighbor who needs kindness, a stray that needs help, a friend who needs one honest text. God often asks us to be the hands of the miracle. If this story touched you, please share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment with a prayer request or a blessing for Buddy and Daisy. And subscribe so we can keep bringing stories that lift the weary and strengthen the heart. May God bless you and your home, protect the ones you love, and guide you into the quiet miracles waiting in your next ordinary day. Amen.